Now, with respect to the evaluation report, Poe says that the report, data from all sources of information shall be considered. That is, there has to be a data integration component to the evaluation. The evaluator's determination shall not be based on one single data source unless clinically justified. Now, does that mean that you would never disqualify a person because of validity scale elevations? No, not if you can clinically justify it. One of the things we'll talk about a little bit later in a bit more detail, but I want to plant the seed now, is that in the process of data integration, Mike talked about this last year at IACP along with Yossi, and that is that we have historically treated psychological testing as generating hypotheses that we then test against or look for confirmatory evidence in behavior, right? I think a reframe of that is justified. Mike and Yossi presented it, and I think compellingly so.
Tell people who Yossi is.
Oh, Yossi, sorry about that. Yossi Ben-Poreth, who's the a co-author of the MMPI-2 restructured form and a international figure in personality assessment. And the assertion, I think the reframe, is that psychological testing produces findings. This is behavior. These aren't hypotheses. Now, that behavior isn't necessarily more valid or reliable than other data sources, but if you are going to take test data known in the literature to have predictive meaning and trump it by interview behavior that has no literature anchors indicating that it has a higher validity or predictive utility than the test results, you're on shallow ground. Don't you think? But we tend to do that, I think. I have certainly been guilty of that in my practice. That the behavior that I see in front of me in my office, I elevate as more meaningful than the test data. That's especially true when the background is clean, the person's really nice, the person presents really well, and I've got these really wacky test results. And I'll somehow say to myself, you know, he's naive, he's young. I'll go over some critical items with him, and he'll say, oh, no, I didn't mean that. He'll have some rationale and justification for some idiosyncratic interpretation of what he really meant when he said, sometimes I hear voices that others don't hear. Because I'm a really very attentive listener, so I hear things, you know, okay. Still, these are findings. And the reason, how I came, and Mike and Yossi Ben-Poreth came to the same conclusions was through an ongoing process of post-mortem analyses of test results after a person we found qualified ended up doing something really bad. And we look at the test results, and in so many of these cases, the test results predicted this behavior, but we found a way to usurp its authority on the basis of our observed behaviors or clinical impressions or beliefs or wishful thinking about the candidate.
So why do a clinical interview at all?
Well, there is an article. The question is, so why do a clinical interview at all? There's two answers that I think are both relevant. One is because regulation and practice standards require it. The more important question is, why do they require it? And I think that there's good reason for that. And the other is because we're normally predicting low base rate behaviors. Low base rate behaviors our ability to predict them is always limited. And there are always going to be risk factors that in the actuarial literature are not covered in the, that are not covered in the actuarial literature. So if we limit our prediction only to those risk factors that are known in the literature to be associated with an outcome, then we would be ignoring new risk factors that absolutely shout out to you that they should be considered. For example, when we look at workplace violence, we know that there are 19 risk factors and 10 protective factors that the literature consistently finds. Should I ignore, though, one that is not covered among those 19, simply because it's a low base rate event, but that to any normal, casual, common sense observer would say, oh my God, that has meaning. In an actuarial model, you would be forced to say, yes, you ignore it. But that would be most applicable if you were trying to predict from a large group to a remote outcome. But if you're trying to predict on an individual or nomothetic basis, you're going to have to include other risk factors that might not be included in the actuarial evidence. So that's only going to come from the form of a clinical interview. There's an article, a chapter coming out, though, in the Handbook of Psychology. Mike Cutler is the author of it. That is a compelling read, and it's an argument for actuarial predictions of police officer applicants, and does question, properly so, the utility of the interview. So I think that there's good argument for both sides. It's an interesting debate. At this point, it's moot in most places because the standard of practice, the IACP guidelines require it. You would be operating outside the standard of practice. The question really is how much weight do you place on it when you have other solid evidence that includes psychological testing?